Welcome to the Political Fallout Shelter, where we come to you each week from a windowless basement here underneath the Capitol. I am Leo Shane, Deputy Editor for Military Times. With me, as always, is the man who puts pro in procurement reform, Joe Gould, the Capitol Hill Bureau Chief for Defense News. And this week we have a special guest, our spectacular Pentagon reporter, Copp from Military Times. Tara, welcome. How have you been?
Good, thanks.
It's a nice and busy time here. So look, we invited you because you've been killing it with a bunch of stories recently, and we wanted to talk about a couple of them right now. Okay. Unfortunately, the first one's a pretty tragic one that was underscored this in the last few days here. We had a WC-130 go down in Georgia. 9 Puerto Rican guardsmen were killed in the event. You've been writing about aviation mishaps and the problems that the DoD has seen. Tell us where we are and what you've found out recently just with your research.
Sure. Well, this unfortunate crash, 2 things. The plane was 63 years old or 53 years old. Mm-hmm. You know, a 53-year-old plane on its final flight to the boneyard, and it makes a nosedive that you could just tell from the video. It's horrific video. You know, basically corkscrews and then goes straight into the ground. Nobody could survive that. You know, the cause of the investigation will come out in the weeks and months to come. But you're already hearing maintainers and pilots use this just latest crash to look at our work, which has looked at all the crashes for the last 5 years, and say there is a crisis in aviation.
Yeah, and this is what your research has shown is that we're seeing all these aging planes. We're seeing not necessarily crashes that are always this large, but this compounding effect of smaller and smaller accidents.
You know, we were all on the Hill in 2013 when Congress enacted sequestration. Mm-hmm. And DoD took that massive budget cut, and the way they had to basically slice that much money in a short amount of time is they had to go after people. Because as Joe, you know, it is much, much more difficult to cut weapon systems because there's sometimes a penalty. They have 3 to 5 year buys. So they went after the personnel. They went after the maintainers, the pilots, these people that were experienced enough that they could offer them basically the opportunity to retire early. So you had all this experience walk out the door. And I think we're really seeing the effects of that now.
So congressional leaders have pushed DoD witnesses when they've been here. I'm thinking of Mike Turner, the chairman of the House Airland Subcommittee. What is the underlying cause here? And to your point, I did notice in your reporting that that maintainers are concerned that more experienced members of their ranks are leaving the service. But do you have a sense of what the underlying cause might be? And is DoD itself doing any kind of broad push to look into this?
So with any crash, it's the result of a chain of events that always culminates in the pilot's reaction to that chain. So was it a spare part that, needed to be replaced and they didn't have the one that they needed on hand? Was it a maintainer who didn't have the right level of supervision because their supervisor took a buyout 3 or 4 years ago? Was it the op tempo because these planes have been basically flying record numbers of sorties and dropping record numbers of munitions in the fight against ISIS? Or is it the funding? Is it all 4 of those things? Because the funding, of course, buys training hours for maintainers and training hours for pilots. Funding buys spare parts. The op tempo is going to happen regardless. But it just seems like you have this culmination of events that has really forced the Congress, forced the Pentagon, forced the media to look because you see plane after plane falling out of the sky.
Has there been has there been a through line throughout? Do we know yet, or we just don't know?
So when we looked at the data, we did multiple FOIAs, probably about 20 FOIAs total, across all of the services, and we asked them to give us their accident data from fiscal year 2011, so we could look and see, what happened before sequestration took effect. And then we analyzed and chopped on the numbers from 2013 on. And so in fiscal year 2011, it was right when the Iraq drawdown was happening. And you saw the numbers start to fall. The services were seeing some relief from the reduced op tempo.
And that makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah,
they had some time for some relief, but then all of a sudden, instead of getting to reset, they had to take, $50 billion out of their budget. Right. And from 2013 on, it's basically just a straight trend line up for accidents.
So let me ask you, because I know this came up this week. Is this a crisis that the Pentagon is taking seriously? Because you've said you've heard a lot from pilots, you've heard a lot from maintainers, but the Pentagon response this week was, well, we're looking into it, it's a problem, but we wouldn't say a crisis.
The Pentagon response this week was tone deaf.
Yeah.
You know, they said it's a crisis for the families, but not a crisis aviation-wide. If you're one of those military families, if you are a pilot, if you're a maintainer who's thinking about getting out of the service, and that's the message you hear that they're not taking this seriously, that they don't see that across the services there's an issue with experience, with aging planes, with the op tempo. You know, you've seen probably in your reporting on the Air Force, pilots are getting out, they can't give them a big enough bonus to keep them. They're having to rehire maintainers. This is happening in other services too. So I think that the Pentagon probably needs to recalibrate what it's messaging.
To my mind, I mean, it dovetails with, reporters covering defense issues have noticed there's been plenty of reporting about the Pentagon's, closing down, becoming less transparent. There was a memo from Jim Mattis about a year ago, the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis about a year ago. I want to say a few weeks ago, the director of the Joint Staff said that it was reluctant to acknowledge this as a crisis. Is there a link in your mind between those two things?
One of the early memos that Mattis sent out, basically direction to all the service chiefs, all the commands, was let's stop talking about readiness issues. In his mind, it broadcasted potential adversaries, our vulnerabilities. There's some truth to that. You don't want to say we can't do this, and our reporting is very cautious, and every reporter out there is very cautious to say the U.S. can't do this or the U.S. can't do that. But there's a lot of difference between that type of reporting and saying, look, our planes are old. Our planes are having this many mishaps. Our planes are only this % ready. To really drive home the point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a contrast from what we're hearing up here on Capitol Hill. We keep hearing from lawmakers again saying, look, you guys, if you're having problems, the Pentagon, you got to tell us. You've got to let us know what these issues are. Otherwise, we can't fix it. And frankly, this week, they've been citing your work. They've been citing the aviation database saying, look, this is evidence of what sequestration has done. This is evidence of what the funding lapses have meant. So it's an interesting disconnect to see that approach.
We've been talking about it in the podcast over the last few weeks that the readiness crisis isn't something that you're just hearing about from pro-defense lawmakers on the House Armed Services Committee. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, has even acknowledged that there's a readiness crisis. So it seems like, and this was a key argument in terms of moving the defense top lines higher. So when you have a Pentagon that's saying that, that's not acknowledging that there's a readiness crisis, and you have Republican leadership here saying that there is, you've got to scratch your head, I think.
It seems strange because the Pentagon, money is just one thing that will help. It's also time, it's training, it's having a reduction in op tempo so that this new generation of maintainers and pilots actually has the time to build in the flight hours, to build in the training experience. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, when we talked to him in the press briefing room this week, said that, your typical captain previously had about 1,200 flying hours. Your captain now has about 600 flying hours. That's going to have long-term effects for the military and its ability to conduct future war operations.
Okay. Well, look, that's one of the topics you've been covering. The other thing I wanted to bring up here to talk about is the issue of immigration in the military, which is something you've been focused on, not just troops, but also family members. I know this week Secretary Mattis said that they're going to take another look at the impact on military families and some of their policies. But talk to us about where that's coming from and what you've been hearing from families.
So at the height of Iraq operations, there was a push on Capitol Hill to look at deportation fears for the spouses and dependents of these service members, because you had a number of service members deployed, who were having to deal with not only the stress of being deployed, but the stress that potentially their spouse was going to be deported because they were undocumented. And so you saw this push in 2010, and ironically, now Vice President Mike Pence was one of the champions of that push on the Hill to say this is not something that service members should have to worry about. Now it seems like that tone has changed completely, and Customs and Immigration is deporting people at record numbers, and it doesn't seem to matter whether their spouse has military service or not.
And this is, I mean, this gets to, again, readiness issues, the military family issues that you and I have covered for many years. This, if you're worried about your spouse being kicked out of the country, if you're worried about your spouse not having enough money to go to the grocery store, that's one thing. But if you're trying to do your mission and you're worried that your spouse may get deported, this just has unbelievable ramifications on your ability to complete the mission.
And it's going to be hard data to get. We'll see what Mattis directs, and we'll see how the services respond. But service members aren't usually willing to say, by the way, I have an undocumented spouse. Right. Not only because of the tenor of the country, which if you look at some of the comments on some of the stories we write, despite supporting the military, these people will say, oh, kick the spouse out.
Right.
You know, nobody wants to cough that up and admit that I have an undocumented spouse, but you fall in love with who you fall in love with. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our service members come from, you know, countries where they're going to fall in love with, you know, someone there who may not be documented.
Well, when you think about the you know, the retention issues, or the, you know, we're at this point we're looking to rebuild the military, right? And that means adding people. And if you're going to make it tougher for some groups of people to join, or create a disincentive for people to join, it seems like it would be counterproductive.
And the military is already having a difficult time meeting its recruiting standards. You know, fewer people in the U.S. meet the fitness standards and can meet the, you know, all of the testing standards that they have to meet to join the military. They're too overweight, basically. Mm-hmm. So why would you cut out a class of people who have been willing to serve, you know, throughout our nation's wars because of a tighter immigration policy?
Well, so let me ask you about that. Because you've talked to a lot of families about this, and one of the things we know about the military is, especially right now, it's such a insular community. If you served in the military, your kids are more likely to be the next round of recruits than someone who has no military history. So not just these families, but the other families you're talking to. I mean, what effect is all this having when they see this uncertainty, not just in DOD, but writ large with the country and immigration? What are they telling you?
You know, it's not just immigration. Actually, it ties right back to the aviation. You have people wondering whether they would recommend military service to their children. They see what's going on with the readiness. They see what's going on with immigrant soldiers. They see what's going on with the standards. And quite frankly, they've seen 17 years of nonstop operations. You know, is there going to be that same propensity that people had after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam, that their parents served, so they're going to serve?
And at the same time, you and I are up here on the Hill covering, as you said, the rebuild of the military. And we're seeing it again in the Defense Authorization Act this year, where they're going to add more end strength. We're talking about 11,000 more troops. You know, we've been doing this for a while. We've seen them struggle with the recruiting side, and now with this new push under Trump of new numbers, it's going to be really interesting to see if they can reach these targets.
Also, it seems like it's kind of a friction point within the Republican Party, because on the one hand, you have there tends to be a lot of support for the military, but there also tends to be this less of an embrace of immigrants. So where's the rubber going to meet the road here, right? Is there going to be some kind of schism? I don't know. I think that when you've got an issue like this that's divisive to Republican leadership, it probably just doesn't come up.
No, and that's interesting. So where do you think it goes from here? I mean, so Mattis is doing this review. They're doing a lot of reviews down at the Pentagon. I don't know when this one will be done. What do you expect them to come back with? Do you think that we could have a Defense Department that takes a strong stance and says, look, we've got to fix our immigration problems in order to maintain our military readiness?
So early in January, he came down specifically to tell us, as the whole DACA debate was going on, that service members and veterans who were DACA were going to be protected. And that was kind of the strongest stand we had seen from Mattis on the immigration issue. He really has not dove into that issue since. He tends to, he's got a lot of things on his plate. We've got a lot of North Korea news. We've got...
Well, and Mattis, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're down there, but he seems to want to focus on military things. And there's a lot of, as with everything with this administration, there's a lot of issues that cut across all these lines. So it wouldn't surprise me that he wouldn't want to deal with immigration for military families, which is 2 or 3 steps removed from direct readiness, but he's going to have to. He can't avoid this.
So I think Mattis has probably been surprised at the sheer number of social issues he's had to deal with, because the president has basically dived into the military and directed on transgender, directed on immigration. You know, these are things that maybe Mattis didn't think he was going to have to handle. Thought it'd be straight up, you know, war on ISIS, probably North Korea, probably Iran. Instead, he's had to spend an inordinate time between our questions in the press and on Capitol Hill talking about these very divisive social issues that, you know, members of Congress don't really agree on.
Okay. So one other thing that Secretary Mattis didn't think he was going to have to deal with, and that we came up again this week, is Space Force. My new favorite topic, because the president keeps coming out and suggesting that we're going to have a sixth military branch. We're going to start to militarize space. So
after the administration said that they did not want a Space Force during the
don't
debate
live
on
in
that.
The past. This is the present. We're going to have Space Force. It's inevitable. So, Joe, what are you looking forward to most about covering Space Force?
Well, I mean, the Battle of Endor notwithstanding, and the successful asymmetric campaign against the Empire there, when are we going to arm the Ewoks? I mean, they're carrying spears. They're severely underfunded. What about Javelin anti-tank missiles for the Ewoks?
We're taping this on May 4th, Star Wars Day. You've got Star Wars on the brain. Tara, give me your impression. Welcome to the ridiculous portion of our podcast here. What does Space Force mean to you?
I'll just have to bring out my inner DoD geek and just say, may the Dove Schwartz be with you.
That's terrible. Just terrible. Well, look, from my perspective, this is spectacular because finally I can write the space uniform stories that Military Times has already wanted. We can do pinks and greens in space. We can do, it's a whole nother level of uniform stories for us to tackle. So, look, we'll be covering that if it comes up, but more important, all the other important issues that we covered here. You can follow us all week long at defensenews.com and militarytimes.com. Joe and I are on Twitter. But Tara, give everybody your Twitter handle because they should be following you and not us.
At taracopp.com. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll be back next week. Thank you so much for tuning in.